Welcome to Truth Behind History, and here is the hook. When people picture power in medieval and early Renaissance Europe, they picture crowns, castles, and cavalry. But what if the bigger story is that power was quietly shifting long before the battlefield decided anything, because the real bottleneck was not bravery, it was coordination. By the end of this video, you will understand how the everyday problems of trade, money, and political fragmentation created a world where financial systems could become the hidden engine behind historical change. So let's set the stage. In late medieval Europe, there was no single, smooth, unified political machine running the continent. Authority was fractured across feudal lords, rival city-states, and competing monarchies, each with their own rules, taxes, and priorities. That fragmentation shaped everything, especially commerce. If you were a merchant moving goods across regions, you were not just navigating geography. You were navigating a patchwork of jurisdictions where a border could mean a new toll, a new legal standard, or a new risk of confiscation. And then there was the money problem. Coinage varied by region, and coin supply could be tight. Coins were physical, heavy, and vulnerable, and their reliability depended on rulers and mints that were often under pressure. In many periods, debasement was a recurring temptation, not always because leaders were villains, but because wars, court expenses, and political survival created strong incentives to stretch limited resources. The result was an environment where the same piece of metal could be treated differently from one town to the next, and where trust in money was never fully guaranteed. Now imagine the practical consequence. Trade was expanding, but the tools for safe, predictable exchange lagged behind. Moving wealth meant moving coin, and moving coin meant risk. Risk of theft on the road. Risk of loss at sea. Risk of being targeted by local authorities. Risk of simply arriving with the wrong currency at the wrong time. In that world, commerce could not scale smoothly just by wishing harder. It needed mechanisms that could bridge distance, reduce exposure, and create reliability without waiting for kings to cooperate. And here is the core systems idea on this slide. When political power is fragmented, and money is unstable or hard to move, people do not stop trading. They innovate around constraints. They build private systems to coordinate where public systems fall short. That is the kind of pressure cooker that produces major institutional breakthroughs, not necessarily in palaces, but in ledgers, contracts, and networks of trust. So as we begin, keep one question in mind. If the rules of society make it hard to exchange value safely, who steps in to solve that problem, and what kind of power do they gain as a result? Florence as financial laboratory is where we zoom in from the broad European map to one specific environment that practically forces innovation. Florence was not a giant empire with vast farmland and an unstoppable army. It was a wealthy, intensely competitive city built on trade, textiles, and the constant pressure to outperform rivals. That matters because it changes what counts as strength. In a place like this, you could not rely on conquest as your main growth strategy. You had to rely on coordination, reputation, contracts, and the ability to move goods and value efficiently. And because Florence was a city-state, politics itself was close to the street. Power was not some distant crown, it was contested by families, guilds, and factions. That kind of competition can be messy, but it also creates incentives. If you are a merchant family, the fastest way to security is not always to buy more swords, it is to build better systems. Better ways to price risk. Better ways to settle accounts. Better ways to keep partners honest without having to constantly threaten them. Florence also had a culture that elevated commercial skill. Merchants and artisans organized through guilds, and those guilds shaped public life. That meant success in business could translate into influence, not automatically, and not without conflict, but in a way that was structurally possible. Here is the systems point on this slide. When centralized power is weaker, there is more room for private solutions to emerge, and those solutions can become the real infrastructure of society. Instead of one authority dictating outcomes from the top, you get networks of people who must negotiate, adapt, and build trust because their survival depends on it. That is why Florence becomes a kind of laboratory. The city is a dense web of transactions where mistakes are punished quickly, and competence is rewarded. That pressure produces experimentation, and the winners are the ones who can reduce friction and uncertainty for everyone around them. So when we talk about Florence, we are not just talking about art and architecture. We are talking about an ecosystem where economic freedom, local competition, and constant bargaining pushed people to invent durable tools for cooperation. And if that sounds abstract, bring it down to a simple question. In a city where no single ruler can make trade safe for everyone, what replaces force as the organizing principle? The answer is usually some mix of trust, enforcement, and incentives, and Florence is a textbook example of how those forces can reshape society from the bottom up. To understand why the Medici Bank matters, we have to treat it less like a single building with a vault, and more like an organization designed to solve a scale problem. The bank is typically dated to 1497, founded by Giovanni di Bicci de' Medici, and what makes it historically important is not just that it made money, it is that it organized finance in a way that could operate across distance. Picture a world where travel is slow, communication is unreliable, and local conditions change fast. In that environment, a centralized office that micromanages everything is not just inefficient, it is fragile. The Medici solution was a network of branches in different cities, connected by relationships and shared methods. Each branch could respond to local realities, local markets, local politics, local clients, while still being part of a recognizable system. That balance is the key. You have local autonomy so the branch can act quickly, but you also have internal rules so the whole operation remains coherent. And this is where institutional design becomes visible. A bank like this is not only selling services. It is producing trust at scale. People are willing to transact because they believe the network will honor its obligations, and because the network has a reputation to protect. Reputation becomes a kind of enforcement mechanism. If you break trust, you do not just lose one deal. You risk losing access to an entire web of partners and opportunities. Notice what that does to incentives. It encourages disciplined behavior, not because a king is watching, but because the network itself rewards reliability and punishes recklessness. And it is also resilient in a specific way. If one location faces trouble, the rest of the network can continue functioning because the structure is distributed rather than tied to one political center. That does not mean it is invincible, but it does mean it can expand without becoming instantly dependent on one ruler or one city's stability. So when you hear the phrase Medici Bank, try to hear something more precise. It is a decentralized organization that uses shared practices to coordinate across geography. That is the innovation. It is an early example of how complex economic activity can be managed through networks rather than through direct political control. And in a world defined by fragmented authority, that kind of network can become a quiet form of infrastructure, shaping who gets funded, who gets connected, and who gets the ability to act on a larger stage. Double-entry bookkeeping sounds like a technical detail, but historically it is one of those quiet inventions that changes what is possible. Before standardized accounting, a lot of business depended on fragmented records, memory, and trust that was hard to verify. That works at a small scale, like a shopkeeper who knows every customer personally. But once you try to operate across cities, across partners, across time, informal tracking becomes a liability. Double-entry bookkeeping is a method that records each transaction in two places, so the books reflect both sides of an exchange. If something comes in, something else must correspondingly go out, or a claim must be created. What that does is create internal consistency. It turns the ledger into a system that can be checked, audited, and compared against reality. And when you can check something, you can manage it. This is where the power comes in. Not power as domination, but power as capacity. With clearer records, a business can plan. It can evaluate which activities are profitable and which are draining resources. It can spot patterns of loss early rather than discovering them when it is too late. It can delegate work to agents and still maintain oversight, because the ledger becomes a shared language that translates local decisions into an understandable picture of the whole. That matters for incentives too. When outcomes are measurable, people behave differently. Managers cannot hide poor performance as easily. Partners can demand clarity. Trust becomes less dependent on personal charisma and more dependent on transparent documentation. And that shift is subtle but enormous. It lowers the cost of cooperation because you do not need perfect personal knowledge of everyone involved. You need a system that reliably represents what is going on. Now, we should be honest about a limit here. Accounting does not remove fraud or bad judgment. A ledger can be manipulated, and numbers can be made to look healthy even when the underlying reality is shaky. But the broader point still holds. Standardized bookkeeping increases the ability of an institution to scale responsibly because it improves information quality inside the organization. And when institutions gain that ability, they do not just move money more efficiently. They change the structure of economic life by making long-distance coordination, risk assessment, and long-term planning far more realistic than it was before. Bills of exchange are one of the best examples of how people build financial tools when the physical movement of money is too dangerous or too inefficient. Imagine you are a merchant who needs to pay for goods in another city. If you carry coin, you face obvious risks: theft, shipwreck, confiscation, and the constant problem of whether your coins will be accepted at full value when you arrive. A bill of exchange offers another path. Instead of transporting metal, you transport a claim. In practical terms, a merchant can arrange for value to be paid in one place, and then receive a written instrument that can be redeemed for value in another place through a trusted network. The details varied across regions and over time, and historians debate the exact mechanics in specific cases, but the core idea is consistent. It turns payment into a coordinated promise rather than a physical transfer. That shift reduces exposure. You are no longer gambling your entire venture on a bag of coin surviving the road. It also increases flexibility. When value can move through paper claims and reputable intermediaries, trade can expand beyond what coin transport would safely allow. There is also a legal and moral layer that matters for the period. In many Christian contexts, charging interest could run into restrictions associated with usury. Bills of exchange created room for financial compensation that could be framed differently, often as exchange costs or currency conversion rather than explicit interest. That does not make the system simple or universally accepted, but it helps explain why the instrument spreads. People were responding to real constraints, including moral rules, legal rules, and practical dangers, by designing contracts that made commerce possible anyway. And this brings us back to systems thinking. A bill of exchange only works if there is trust in the network behind it. The paper itself is not valuable because it is paper. It is valuable because the parties believe it will be honored, and because the reputational consequences for breaking that trust are severe. In other words, this is a decentralized solution to a coordination problem. Instead of waiting for a government to issue a perfectly stable, universally accepted currency and to guarantee safe travel across borders, merchants and bankers create a mechanism that makes trade workable in the world as it is. It is not magic. It is contract plus reputation plus incentives. And once that infrastructure exists, money becomes more mobile, commerce becomes more interconnected, and the distance between markets starts to shrink in a very real economic sense. Finance as political leverage is where we confront a reality that shows up again and again in history. If you control the conditions under which others can access resources, you can shape their choices even if you never wear a crown. The Medici Bank, like other major financial houses of the era, did business with powerful clients, including popes and monarchs. The point is not to reduce politics to a conspiracy, because history is always more complicated than that. The point is to notice the mechanism. Large institutions and rulers often needed funds, sometimes for routine governance, sometimes for major projects, and sometimes for conflict. When credit becomes part of that equation, relationships shift. A lender does not have to issue commands to have influence. Influence can come from dependency. If a ruler relies on a financial network to access money or move value across borders, that ruler has incentives to keep that network stable, to keep its trust intact, and to avoid actions that would cut off future access. Even the possibility of losing credit can shape behavior. It changes what options feel available. It changes what risks seem tolerable. It changes how quickly decisions must be made. And this is especially significant because it operates without formal sovereignty. The bank does not need to govern territory to matter. It can affect outcomes by altering constraints and opportunities for decision makers. This also works in the other direction. Political leaders and institutions can influence banks by granting privileges, offering protection, or creating opportunities that others do not get. So the relationship is not one-sided. It is a negotiation shaped by incentives on both sides. But step back and you can see the broader pattern. Financial systems can become a parallel form of power. They are not the same as armies or laws, but they can steer them. And it raises a serious question that is not about taking sides, it is about understanding causality. When the ability to act politically depends on access to credit, who is really setting the boundaries of political action? The person giving orders, or the system that determines what is financially possible? This slide is about something historians and economists both learn to respect. Incentives do not care about anyone's intentions. Even if an institution starts strong, the environment it operates in can reward behaviors that slowly undermine it. When a major bank becomes deeply entangled with political power, the risk profile changes. It is no longer only evaluating merchants, trade, and ordinary commercial activity. It is also exposed to court politics, factional struggles, and the unpredictable needs of powerful clients. And powerful clients are a special category because their promises are not enforced the same way as everyone else's. If a small merchant defaults, the consequences can be immediate. If a ruler delays payment, restructures obligations, or treats debt as a political tool, the lender may have limited options. That is not a moral judgment. It is a structural reality. Now add favoritism into the mix. If access to deals begins to depend on connections rather than on disciplined evaluation, market discipline weakens. A bank can start making decisions to maintain status, avoid conflict, or secure privilege, rather than making decisions that are financially prudent. The incentives are easy to see. Staying close to power can bring opportunities that are not available to competitors. But it can also create pressures to extend credit where it should not be extended, or to tolerate risks that would normally be unacceptable. Over time, those choices can accumulate. And here is the key idea of unintended outcomes. A strategy that looks smart in the short run, such as securing influential clients or aligning with political elites, can generate fragility in the long run. Because the bank's success becomes linked to political stability it does not control. If the political landscape shifts, if factions change, if wars disrupt trade, if rulers default, the bank absorbs shocks that are not purely economic. Again, we should be careful not to oversimplify. There were many factors in any historical rise and decline, and sources can disagree about emphasis. But the incentive logic is hard to ignore. Once an institution relies on privilege and proximity to power, it becomes more vulnerable to the very forces that privilege depends on. And that vulnerability is not just financial. It affects trust. Trust is the invisible asset behind any financial network. When trust erodes, even a strong institution can weaken quickly because its relationships are its infrastructure. So this slide is asking you to watch for a recurring pattern in history. When systems begin as voluntary networks built on trust, and then become entangled with political advantage, the incentives change, and the unintended consequences often arrive quietly before they arrive suddenly. Centralization versus networks is really a question about how systems handle complexity. A decentralized network spreads decision-making across local nodes, while a centralized system concentrates authority in a single core. Each has strengths, but each also comes with predictable trade-offs, and history gives us plenty of evidence to examine those trade-offs without needing to moralize. Start with the network model. When branches or partners have local autonomy, they can respond quickly to local conditions. If a market shifts in one city, the local manager can adapt without waiting for distant approval. That flexibility can increase resilience because the system is not dependent on one set of decisions being correct everywhere. It can also distribute risk. If one node faces a crisis, the entire structure does not automatically collapse, because other nodes can continue operating. But networks are not effortless. They require shared rules, shared standards, and a strong culture of accountability, otherwise the system becomes chaotic or vulnerable to inconsistency. Now consider centralization. A centralized system can enforce uniform policy. It can coordinate large actions with a single plan. It can reduce internal variance by requiring everyone to follow the same procedures. That kind of control can be attractive, especially when leaders want predictability. But the cost is often adaptability. When decisions must flow through one center, the system can become slower and less sensitive to local knowledge, and concentrated authority can amplify errors. If the center makes a poor decision, that mistake spreads widely because everyone is required to follow it. In other words, centralization can trade flexibility for control. The deepest point on this slide is that resilience is not only about strength, it is about structure. A system that can adjust locally often survives shocks better than a system that depends on one authority anticipating every shock correctly. And this is where incentives matter again. In decentralized networks, local actors have incentives to protect local reputation and performance. In centralized systems, local actors may have stronger incentives to please the center, even when local reality suggests a different approach. That is not always the case, but it is a common pattern. So when you look at historical institutions, whether financial or political, one of the most useful questions you can ask is simple. Where does decision-making live, and what does that do to information, incentives, and error correction? Because that is often where the long-term consequences begin. Legacy in modern finance is not about claiming a straight line where everything today is simply a copy of the Renaissance. It is about recognizing that certain underlying problems do not go away, and certain solutions keep reappearing because they are structurally useful. The Renaissance world needed ways to track value, manage risk, and coordinate trust across distance. Modern finance still needs the same things, even if the tools look different on the surface. Think about it. Banking is not just money sitting somewhere. Banking is a system for recording claims, settling obligations, and coordinating expectations among people who cannot all know each other personally. That is why ledgers matter. Whether the records are ink on paper or digital entries, the core function is the same. The system needs a reliable way to represent who owes what, who owns what, and what has changed over time. And that pulls us back to institutional design. Financial institutions are not only collections of individuals. They are rule systems with incentives. They define what information is visible, who is accountable, and how errors are corrected. The Renaissance innovations we discussed earlier highlight that design matters as much as intent. A well-designed system can encourage transparency, discipline, and cooperation. A poorly designed system can encourage concealment, fragility, or reckless behavior, even if nobody wakes up in the morning hoping to cause harm. Another important legacy is the indirect relationship between finance and politics. In the modern world, we still see financial institutions shaping political possibilities, not necessarily through obvious control, but through constraints, dependencies, and the availability of resources. That does not mean every outcome is planned. It means systems interact. And when systems interact, incentives can travel across the boundary. Political decisions affect markets. Market structures affect political decisions. That feedback loop is not a modern invention, it is an old pattern. So the biggest takeaway from this slide is not a single fact, it is a way of seeing. Tools outlive their creators. Once a society develops a reliable method for tracking obligations and moving value, that method tends to persist, evolve, and embed itself into the normal functioning of life. And because these tools are embedded, they quietly shape what people believe is possible. What kind of trade can happen? What kind of projects can be funded? What kind of institutions can grow? If you want to understand the modern world, one of the most honest approaches is to stop focusing only on personalities and start paying attention to the structures they operate within. Because the structures, more often than not, are what makes certain outcomes repeat. When we step back for final reflections on power, the simplest lesson is also one of the most uncomfortable. The world is often shaped less by dramatic moments and more by the systems that quietly structure daily life. People tend to remember wars, elections, and famous leaders because those are visible. But underneath those events are mechanisms that decide what can scale, what can endure, and what can survive shock. Trust is one of those mechanisms. It is not sentimental. It is functional. Trust determines whether strangers can cooperate, whether contracts can replace force, and whether value can move without constant fear. And once you see that, you start noticing how many of history's turning points are really turning points in coordination. Another lesson is that power does not always look like a throne. Power can be the ability to set boundaries on what others can do. It can be the ability to reduce uncertainty for some people while increasing it for others. It can be the ability to design a system where certain behaviors are rewarded and other behaviors become too costly. And that brings us to the moral questions this history quietly raises. If systems shape outcomes over time, then responsibility is not only about individual virtue. It is also about the rules and incentives we normalize. A society can contain many decent people and still produce distorted outcomes if its systems reward short-term advantage, punish transparency, or concentrate decision-making in ways that block error correction. On the other hand, a society can give ordinary people surprising agency if its systems allow voluntary cooperation, local knowledge, and competition in ideas and services. None of this requires a perfect world. It just requires clarity about cause and effect. So here is the invitation. When you hear a dominant narrative about why something happened, ask yourself what the incentives were, what information was visible, and who had the ability to adapt. Ask where trust came from, and what threatened it. Ask what was centralized, what was decentralized, and what the trade-offs were. Because if you can see systems, you can see patterns, and if you can see patterns, you are harder to manipulate by simplistic explanations. That is the real payoff of studying history this way. Thanks for watching Truth Behind History. If this helped you see the past and the present with sharper eyes, please like, comment, and subscribe. And here is my question for you. Do you think the biggest driver of historical change is leadership or the systems that make certain choices possible in the first place?